Prime Minister Mark Carney promised Canadians and the natural resources industries that power the national economy that he would fast track major projects, lowering approval time from 5 years to two. One way to do that is to combine federal and provincial environmental impact assessments. There's one province already doing that, British Columbia. But the case of Woodfibre LNG and the town of Squamish demonstrates why faster is not always better. Local groups have filed a lawsuit alleging that the federal government's assessment of the project was a rubber stamp, that the community's concerns about crime, substance abuse, and violence against Indigenous women and girls were not taken seriously. I spoke with Tracey Saxby, Executive Director of My Sea to Sky, one of the groups behind the legal action, about the extent of the problem and what her organization hopes to achieve. Welcome to the interview, Tracey.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is a very interesting case because we've had the federal government, the new Prime Minister Mark Carney, say they want to fast track resource projects. And the Woodfibre LNG project near Squamish, BC, is an example of one that has been through that one window, one regulator approval process with all kinds of consequences. And now you've launched a lawsuit against the Woodfibre plant and the alleging that the federal, well, it's not against the plan, but against the project, alleging that the federal government, the environmental process, assessment process is broken. Maybe just give us an overview of the suit and the issue, if you would, please.
Yeah, for sure. So when this project was first proposed in 2014, um, we highlighted that there was no housing for Woodfibre LNG's workers more than 10 years ago. The response from Woodfibre LNG was, don't worry, we'll hire local. So instead of having an opportunity to build legacy housing or something that would really benefit the community long term, these kinds of projects, these kinds of resource extraction projects are boom or bust, and they are doing everything they can to keep their costs down. And because they weren't certain if they were going to go ahead, they did not want to commit to that kind of expense of building legacy housing that would provide a benefit for the community for generations to come. So what they've opted for instead is this float in, float out temporary solution, which is a retrofitted cruise ship that they are docking in our House Sound, which is a UNESCO biosphere region. And that is for 600 workers. Um, so the issue that we're dealing with is that this floating work camp wasn't assessed as part of the original assessment. And because it's a substituted assessment process, there was originally the provincial government was in charge of doing all of the assessments for this project. But once the decision statements were made, it sort of split back into two again. And so there was a public engagement process through the province. These kind of public engagement processes are always broken, always meaningless. It always feels like a rubber stamp, and that public engagement is completely meaningless because you get zero notice that they're going to happen. You have 30 days to review thousands of pages of documents, somehow hire experts, find experts to provide input on the content that you're being asked to review. And then often the public comments don't seem to have any kind of impact on the final decision, and the project just gets rubber stamped. So once these projects get their initial environmental permit, it seems like every other permit is just expected to be a rubber stamp, and nothing really changes for these projects. So because the environmental assessment process split back into two, the federal government was also meant to have a public comment period on this process. And we were promised the opportunity to provide input from 2019 onwards. And what happened is that there's emails and back and forth with the agency trying to like determine how does this process work? How can we engage in the process? What is the timing? When is it all going to happen? And instead, we were promised throughout that process that there was going to be an opportunity to engage. And so we prepared. We hired experts, we hired lawyers, and we were ready to participate in the process with more time this time. Um, And then the agency decided that they weren't going to have a public engagement process and they approved the floating work camp. So, what essentially happened is that the federal government sidestepped their own process to the benefit of a foreign-owned fossil fuel company. And what we are hoping to achieve through this court case is we are asking the court to find that the federal government followed an unfair process when it approved Woodfibre LNG's work camp, and that they failed to discharge their duty to protect human rights and to protect the environment. So that is it in a nutshell.
Well, that's a good summary. So we've got 650 workers that will be housed in the flotel, as it's being called, and there's an application been made for a second one, which would house approximately 900 workers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And then Fortis BC, which is a separate project but is linked because they're building the pipeline to get the gas to the Woodfibre site. They had a separate proposal for a third work camp for another 650 workers.
So one of the concerns that has arisen from this project is lack of public consultation, the lack of the potential impact on the local community, and the specific concern would be on Indigenous women and girls, because there's often, when these big man camps, there's prostitution and drug use and other sorts of unsavory, illegal kinds of activities that go on, and that's a significant part of your opposition to the project, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so with the floating work camp, there was never really an opportunity to provide that input or feedback to make the floating work camp safer for the workers themselves, as well as for example, the servicing workers. So in addition to the fossil fuel workers or the LNG workers, there are a whole heap of other workers that essentially service the hotel. So these are people that clean all of the rooms, do all of the cooking, and so they are also impacted by this project. But they're not sort of included in the numbers of Woodfibre LNG's workers.
Okay, and when do you've launched the lawsuit, and what's the how is that process likely to unfold?
Yeah, so we had our first day in court yesterday. This is our first legal challenge that has proceeded to court, so this is all very new for us. We're a very small nonprofit organization. We're led by the grassroots. Hundreds of people have donated to make these legal actions possible and to help us hold both the federal and provincial governments accountable and Woodfibre LNG accountable and to make sure that they follow the law. So it's really exciting to have that kind of community support. But this is very much a David versus Goliath story. We are challenging the federal government. We are challenging provincial government in other legal actions. We're challenging Woodfibre LNG and Fortis BC. So David versus several Goliaths. um, and we're fighting. We're fighting to do our best to make sure that they follow the law and to hold them accountable.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier on that this is a particular interest at the moment because the federal government, Mark Carney and the Liberals ran on expediting building infrastructure projects, and specifically talked about resource projects, and there's a lot of pressure from the Alberta oil and gas industry, the Alberta government, to do more LNG. The BC government seems to be on board with that. And I think Carney, if I remember correctly, explicitly promised that he would move the approval process from 5 years to 2 years. And it seems that if public consultation is an issue, consideration of local concerns is an issue, consideration of environmental impacts are an issue, 2 years seems like a very short time.
Yeah, and it's going to mean that public engagement is even less meaningful. There's going to be even less time to participate or respond. Yeah, so there's a lot of fallout and confusion, and this is very, very relevant case, given how Carney and EB are both proposing to fast track similar projects. From our perspective, destructive resource extraction projects like this need more oversight, not less. There needs to be independent experts that are reviewing these projects. Right now, the process often relies on the proponent's own experts, and that's a really big problem because there's a major conflict of interest there, whereby the proponent says, "Hey, we've got this big project, everything's fine," um, and then the government just signs off on it. So there's no independent review, and this is why there's a huge burden that is being placed on the public to provide input, but then that is also ignored, and it often feels like these projects just get a rubber stamp.
Right. Now there are already workers living on the flotel, if I understand. Do you know how many and what kind of an impact you're already seeing in the community?
Yeah, so our communities are on the front lines of this. We're already experiencing the impacts of the workers and the work camps nearby. Um, there are there have been major concerns that have been filed about the service workers. That has come from a separate labor union that has been working to organize the service workers on the flotel. There have been issues with transporting the workers to and from the flotel. So a lot of the impacts associated with the flotel were never assessed. And we're seeing so many transits of marine vessels that are transporting the workers to and from the airport or to and from Vancouver kind of area through Howe Sound to get to the Woodfibre site. Some of those vessels are incredibly noisy. And so we've been getting complaints from residents all around our Ketsam House Sound saying, "Hey, what the hell is going on with this boat that is driving through multiple times a day that is incredibly loud and causing all sorts of underwater noise impact issues." There's all sorts of unknowns related to human rights impacts and how the workers themselves are, like their health and well-being on an isolated floating work camp like this. There's all sorts of unknowns about other human rights issues, particularly for women and girls and Indigenous women and girls, and how they might be being impacted. There's so many unknowns about the impacts to the environment. All of this because the project was never assessed. It was a rubber stamp approval, and and now we're just having to deal with the consequences.
Let's talk about the social consequences and impacts for a moment. So we're talking about, I mean, these camps are going to be 90 plus percent male, correct?
That's
So
correct.
you've got the Fortis BC camp, you've got the existing flotel, you've got a potential of another flotel. That sounds like 2,000-ish kind of workers. Would that be a reasonable estimate?
Yeah, so yeah, more than that. 600, 600. Yeah, it's approaching a lot more than that because there's also other workers that are living in the community. So in addition to the work camps, there's also um, management level workers that are living in the community. There's essentially an unregulated work camp right in downtown Squamish because Woodfibre LNG took over a 45 unit apartment building for their management workers.
So this sounds like exactly what the oil and gas industry has been asking for. They would say, well, look, we've got a couple thousand workers employed, and look at all the business that they bring to the local community, and the jobs they create directly and induced by spending all of that money and so on. Your argument is, if I understand this correctly, is that while that may all be true, there are unintended or unplanned for consequences against, Indigenous women and girls and within the community. Policing all of these, policing resources will be strained. Infrastructure will be strained. Environmental impacts on the Howe Sound, and they have been kind of swept under the rug or rubber stamped by the environmental assessment office, and they're not being addressed. Have I sort of summed up the argument correctly?
Yeah, you've summed it up. I would add traffic impacts. There's all of the waste and how that's being dealt with. That was never really assessed either. And so it's sort of been after the fact that they're figuring out like, well, what are we going to do with all of the sewage and all of the grey water from this floating work camp, and where is that going to go and how is that going to be treated? There has already been a severe traffic accident where a Fortis BC subcontractor made an illegal U-turn on the highway, which affected a Squamish family, three people that ended up with severe life-changing injuries. There have already been reports from women in the communities, from mothers saying that their teenage daughters are getting approached in parking lots in the supermarkets by men, by strangers. Things that are new and that weren't happening to this extent in the past. We're getting all sorts of reports of teenage girls meeting workers at one of the sites where workers get transported to and from the site. Yeah, so there's all sorts of human rights impacts. There's traffic impacts. Yeah, these kinds of work camps are known to be associated with increased crime, increased substance abuse. It puts strain on local hospitals and other service providers. So there's a whole range of social impacts that are associated with these camps.
Is this, in your opinion, would you say that this is almost like a case study of what happens when you fast track a project and when the process is compressed and the work isn't being the impact assessment work isn't being done the way it should be, and public consultations are not as thorough as they should be. Local regulators, local governments like the Squamish First Nation or the town of Squamish aren't, their concerns aren't being taken into account because given the promises that have been made by Prime Minister Carney and the federal government and his energy minister, Tim Hodgson, that if this is how every major project that's going to be fast tracked turns out, then particularly the people of BC, who will see a lot of these LNG plants and pipelines being built, I think we'd be fairly worried about that.
Yeah, we're really worried about this whole idea of fast tracking major infrastructure projects like this. Um, from our perspective, these kinds of projects require more oversight, not less. There needs to be independent experts reviewing them and providing input to make the projects better. And there also needs to be a mechanism to say no to these projects. And that is what seems to be missing from both the provincial and the federal assessment process. There's really no mechanism to say, we don't want this. This doesn't make sense. This is a bad project in a bad location. It's a bad idea. Um, and no, you're not going to get approved. Instead, what we see is politically motivated approvals of these projects. When Woodfibre LNG was first approved by the BC Liberals back in 2015, there was a major conflict of interest because the BC Liberals at that time had a mandate to develop LNG export facilities. It was a rubber stamp. The project got approved. It should never have been approved. And then in 2020, when they applied for the extension, the individual, the government staff person that was responsible for assessing and approving the extension for Woodfibre LNG, guess what? He's working for Woodfibre LNG now. So this project got yet another rubber stamp approval for their extension, and now the government staff person that was responsible for that decision is working for the company. So there's a revolving door between industry and government. There is complete lack of trust in the process by the public. Our comments have been disregarded and dismissed, and it feels completely meaningless to participate. And there also, I think one final thing that needs to happen, there needs to be a mechanism to cancel these projects when they are no longer in the public interest. So when this project was first approved back in 2014, our understanding of the climate impacts and what was happening is very different to what we understand now. And we know from all of the science that has, like, there's more than a decade of science since then, we cannot build new fossil fuel infrastructure. We know that Woodfibre LNG is essentially a shell game and that it's likely going to end up as a stranded asset that taxpayers will be responsible for paying the cleanup costs of. We know all of this, and yet the project is still moving ahead, and it is getting rubber stamp after rubber stamp because of these political decisions that have very little oversight. And so when Premier Eby and Prime Minister Carney are talking about fast tracking other projects that are in the political interest or that are politically significant, that is extremely concerning to me.
Um, I understand this, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in this story is because on that angle, the need for a particular project. And right now, there's a lot of talk in Alberta about building a new pipeline to the West Coast. So, like Trans Mountain expansion, they want to, revive Northern Gateway, maybe put it up to Prince Rupert. And the idea would be that this oil would be shipped off to Asia. And nobody ever asked the question, are there customers in Asia that want it? If you build a 25-year pipeline, what is going to be the oil demand in 2050? And, could this become a stranded asset? And could, a lot of public money be lost? And then, we've gone through had all of these negative impacts for an asset that really didn't provide a lot of benefits. And so we see that for the pipeline, and I only imagine like there's been a lot of debate about where natural gas and LNG demand is going internationally, and the industry just seems to assume that demand is going to expand exponentially over time, well beyond 2050. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says no, peak in 2030. And those kinds of bigger questions around demand and where the industry is going don't ever seem to be addressed in these kinds of projects. And it sounds like it wasn't in this one.
No, it wasn't ever assessed. And when Woodfibre LNG was making their initial assessments of like projections of customers, they completely ignored the renewable energy industry because that's their main competitor. So LNG, if it is produced and exported, um, its main competitor is renewable energies. And it is cheaper to invest in renewable energy per gigawatt of power than it is to buy LNG. So why would these Asian countries pay up to three times the price, if not more, for a fossil fuel when they can get their energy from renewable energy a third of the price, if not more or less?
Right. Well,
So,
you've just asked a question for which the answer is very complex. And that's okay. We should grapple with these, and we should know that there are big error bars. It could go this way, it could go this way. It depends how demand plays out. It depends on a whole range of things, but we never have the conversation. The company comes and says, "Oh, don't worry about it. We've got lots of customers. The demand is going to grow," and we take them at their word, and we never stress test their assumptions.
yeah,
And
so that's where we're missing that expert, that independent expertise that is reviewing the proponent's claims. Instead, what we're seeing through these processes is the proponent says everything's fine, nothing to see here, and then government just goes, okay, we believe them, and they sign off on it.
yes, and your point, and I guess that this will be an important point in your lawsuit, is that there needs to be, even if it takes longer and costs more money, it's really important to dot your I's, cross your T's, do a good job assessing whether or not this project is needed, the impacts it will have, rather than glossing over all of that and getting to the construction part.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Tracey, thank you very much for this. We'll be checking back with you on a regular basis because I think that the recent election has put this kind of project on the national radar, and it's like a case study of how not to do things when you're, undertaking resource projects. So, thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.